Thank you, sir. That was a very lovely reception and an interesting, thought-provoking presentation. May I now request Mr. Tilotia, the man who wrote the book, The Making of India. Tell us, what are we making?
Thank you and good evening. I'll take a very different perspective from what I've heard from the first two speakers and talk a lot more about how maybe we should embrace the market somewhat more, and maybe that is something that we are not doing in India already or currently. One of the key theses of the book that I have written is, in India we face something called a huge private cost of public failure. Now, what do I mean by this convoluted term which economists would love? There is a significant public failure that has happened across public goods in India. And I take 6 such goods which are necessary for human beings to just survive and achieve their potential. We heard about human capital here and how we need to nurture it, but I think there are 6 public goods that all of us as Indians and human beings need. And what are those? From our politicians, we have heard about Bijli, Sadak, and Pani. To this, I add Shiksha, Swasthya, and Suraksha. What that basically means is, across all of these 6 key categories, which are basic for our human sustenance. Okay, sorry, I will. Bijli is power, Sadak is roads. Can you give me the cues? Bijli, Sadak, Pani. Pani is water, Shiksha is education, Swasthya is health, and Suraksha is security. And we can talk about both financial and physical security here in India, but we'll come to maybe all of these aspects. I think across all of these 6 public goods, and we will come to the discussion possibly of saying whether the government should provide this or whether the private sector should provide this, but these are fundamental needs that I think all of us have that need to get provided such that the human capital can get nurtured. Where we have erred, I think, in the way India has approached addressing challenges on some of these is we have tried to muzzle the price mechanism in this or the market mechanism in this. I know this is not necessarily a great word today, hearing what Mr. Dhal had to say in his opening remarks about private sector, profits, etc. But to some extent, our efforts at providing some of these basic goods and services from the public sector have not necessarily met the mark. And I think if you look at even power sector as an example, it is disheartening to see that large parts of Gangetic India, still the power consumption is less than 400 units per year per person, something that most of us would consume in a month in a household. So to some extent, whether we have been able to give the citizens of India the basic public goods is something that I think we need to really come back and think whether our approach of trying to muzzle prices, bring down prices such that everybody can be a consumer is something that is held out. Let me run through all of these 6 goods that I have spoken about, the public goods that I have spoken about, and talk to you about how maybe our policy has failed us. And we spoke about power, saying that there is still a huge amount of inequality in power because there are a lot of people who simply cannot afford power. And I think if some of you saw the initial animation that was there, we still think of consumers as thief. We still think of consumers, and there is some good reason for it, but we have never treated the citizens as consumers of this. We have not empowered them to have the purchasing power to reach out and have this power. Now, we are now in a situation where we are talking about direct benefit transfers, etc. But let me try and exemplify how we could potentially think of this story differently. And what attracted my attention and what has been of big news today over the last couple of days has been these big announcements of 2 lakh, 3 lakh crores being given out to people in Bihar as part of the election packages over the next 5 years. Many of these, most of this money in some sense will go in investments in infrastructure. This infrastructure will again not yield the set of returns that the government expects it to get, simply because the consumers will not have the ability to pay for this infrastructure. If we could convert as citizens by transferring some of this money to them as consumers and then get power companies, education companies, other companies, etc., to go and fight for that share of pie that reaches out to that consumer, potentially it reinvigorates the entire system. let's do broad maths on this. There are numbers which talk about 3.5 lakh crores being given out over the next 5 years to people in Bihar. That amounts to roughly about 70,000 crores being given out every year. For a population of 10 crores, that's about 7,000 rupees being given out per person per year. Even if they were to spend, let's say, 50% of that, and I'm just being generous here, for the power sector, that's 3,500 rupees per person. Now you tell the power companies that go out and reach out to these guys and grab that 3,500 rupees from them as consumers because that's already loaded in their Aadhaar accounts. You suddenly have a reinvigorated system which potentially wants to reach out to those people. Instead, the potential way in which we have approached some of these problems is, can we use this money to create infrastructure and give out low-cost electricity? Nobody in the process seems to be making money. Let's move that example to something different, potentially water, for example. Bombay is a great example where we find that in people who have, they are able to afford water tankers, the 10,000 huge tankers, the 10,000 liter tankers that you get, paying 1,000, 1,200 rupees per tanker. You try and get the BMC to collect that sort of money, it simply doesn't work. We still price water at about 5 rupees per 1,000 liters in Bombay, while the people who have that money, people who have the ability to buy private water, potentially buy it at 1,000 rupees. Is there an equilibrium that can be built out such that you extract value out of consumers who potentially have the ability to pay, empower the customers, citizens financially such that they become consumers? Our willingness to see our citizens as consumers in some sense has been very, very low. We have approached many of these public good issues as saying that we have to do it as a government for our people. That is exactly the same thing that plays out in Shiksha. We want to give free education to all without looking at the quality. Can we give out education vouchers? Can we give them choice such that people then decide who that money goes to? I think those are emerging trends of thinking of the citizen as a consumer, which is, I think, very, very relevant. You can move that into any of the other verticals that I have spoken about. And I think across all these public goods, the fact that we are not able to provide people the basic ability to get them the basic infrastructure for their lives means that we are tethering our people, our country in a sense, to a much lower level of existence. This has meant that there is significant private cost, and the private cost is borne by citizens like you and me, by everyone. And every time that we, in some sense, impinge on the market process of saying that no, the contracts that we have signed don't hold, the toll roads that you have put up, the tolls don't hold, I think to some extent we are killing the way in which we will have to build out our own infrastructure. At the end of the day, the entire cycle has to work where we finally are able to create consumers who are able to demand the infrastructure such that we are able to afford basic public goods to people. What I will also talk about possibly, and because there has been so much of distrust for market price mechanisms, is market price mechanisms have actually worked in India. And that is something that we should, in some sense, take a pride on. If you go back to 2009-10, when there was the first sudden bout of inflation, in the recent memory, of course, in pulses in India. Now, pulses is something that the government does not buy. It typically buys only rice and wheat. Pulses production in India around that point in time was around 14 million tons. We consume about 17, 18 million tons. And because there was a bad year, suddenly prices went up for potentially the first time to 100 rupees a kg. This is a sector which the government does not typically intermediate in because the FCI typically does not pick up stuff. Over the next couple of years, as that market price mechanism flowed back to the farmers, we suddenly found that we are surplus in pulses. And over the last 2 years, prices have come down. And that cycle, in some sense, repeats itself, where we are beginning to see pulses prices come down. We get very, very affected and concerned whenever prices begin to move without letting the market price mechanism go back. The same problem holds out, for example, in onion. Every time the government announces a minimum export price, it in some sense is indicating to the market that this is a price that I'm comfortable playing out in the market. It doesn't work that way. You let that process work over a long period of time such that a comfort and a trust begins to build that suddenly markets will not be impinged upon. I think you begin to see much better outcomes. You begin to see a lot more stability. Staying with agriculture sector, if you think about how suddenly we see that fruits and vegetables, the amount of fruits and vegetables that we grow in India in terms of tonnage, will now, this year, be much more than the tonnage that we will grow for wheat and rice, which used to be the primary produce that was there in India. It's simply because we have not significantly fiddled around with prices in that sector. Same story for the dairy sector. I think if we begin to let that notion begin to come in and don't think of profit as a dirty word, I think we will potentially have converted our citizens into consumers. And once we empower our citizens as consumers, a lot of supply chains begin to change and improve much better and are far more effective. I do hope as part of the discussion here, you will potentially begin to think about some ways in which we begin to think of citizens as consumers, not someone who needs to be threatened to go to jail because they were trying to steal. We just need to empower them such that, financially empower them such that they have the ability to make, sorry, okay. And okay, that just took away the punchline, I think. But we just need to empower our citizens as financially empowered consumers. And I think if that is a discussion that we can move towards in many of these public goods, and power being one of the key components, we start with Bijli, I think that would have been some sort of a good achievement. Thank you.